it's not just about where you put the microphones and getting a great sound, but even more important is getting great music. When we started Blue Coast Records, we wanted the passion. And the way we found that was without headphones, people playing live in the same room, positioned where they could hear each other.
The Fidelity Exchange, pulling back the curtain on brands shaping high-end audio and more.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Fidelity Exchange. I'm Drew Baird from Moon Audio, and today's conversation is with Cookie Marenco, founder of Blue Coast Records and one of the pioneers of high-resolution audio recording. Cookie's been recording Grammy-nominated artists for over 40 years using a live in-the-studio technique called extended sound environment. Cookie, welcome to the Fidelity Exchange.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me a little bit about your history for those of the folks that don't know you very well out there in the world of audio.
I started as a musician, started playing the piano when I was about 4 or 5. And then when I was 10, played a little violin. And then when I was, I think about 12, I picked up the oboe and I was still studying the piano. And from then on, became pretty active in the classical community, but I wanted to study more jazz and improvisational music. Went to college as a music major. When you play the oboe and the English horn, you can go just about anywhere. But it wasn't really my desire to play in an orchestra. I started studying jazz with a man named Lande, who is actually has a couple of records on Blue Coast.
Yep.
He was an ECM recording artist, has a number of albums. I don't know how many hundreds of albums he's been on as a sideman and under his own name. Art was my jazz teacher and my composition teacher. And then somewhere early on, I got fascinated by sound, and I was tuning pianos and overtone series and what I call temperaments, and wondering what existed beyond the land of just Western culture and 12-tone rows. I'm sort of fascinated by the idea of even Bach creating a whole series of preludes and fugues for each key, really, and major and minor. And it was really because they had developed equal temperament. But I wondered, what was it before that? Like, what were people using? And the harpsichords and the tuning systems and what's called mean tunings. So I started studying tuning the piano and also wondered what other music cultures sounded like, and got involved with North Indian classical music and studied the sitar with Krishna Bhatt, and actually ended up recording an album with him and Zakir Hussain, who's a world-renowned tablaist and amazing drummer. And then during those days I was in a band, as many people were, and playing avant-garde jazz and playing with crazy people like Sonny Simmons and a few other folks. And one day somebody said, your place would make a great studio. And I thought, really? Okay. So, we turned the lower level of the house into a studio. Yeah. Me and my boyfriend at the time, who was the drummer in the band, we each put in $10,000. It was 1982. And I walked into a place called Sound Genesis and I said, hey, who wants my money? And a fellow named Dave Van Hoy said, I'll take it. And the interesting thing to me is Dave and I are still great friends. And the owner of Sound Genesis, Dave Angris, also still great friends to this day. And this is 43 years later. And so he sold me great gear. And then 6 months later, we realized we had to spend another $20,000, and I've been in debt ever since with the studio.
Yeah, that's sort of like most audiophiles, too. We're all addicted to gear, and we're constantly looking at ways, what can we sell in the house so I can buy another toy?
Yeah, exactly.
I totally get it. So, what was the moment that you realized that, most recording engineers were using headphones and such to capture something that you were finding that you couldn't capture overdubs with headphones, and you sort of changed philosophies in the way you were recording bands. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
So my studio is called OTR Studios, and with the demise of Fantasy and the record plant and a few other places, we're the oldest commercial recording facility on the peninsula, within probably 100 miles of San Francisco.
Yeah.
And so for the first 20 years, I was really devoted to being, your usual audio engineer, taking in whatever projects I could. And most of it involved recording on tape, doing overdubs, punching in, and learning kind of the usual language. And I remember somewhere in the late 90s, I think it was, Kenny Arnoff, who's a well-known drummer, Kenny was learning some music, and the artist was just sitting there singing, and all the musicians were sitting in a circle, no headphones, just rehearsing the music that they were going to play. I thought to myself, I should be recording this. This is when people are most relaxed. They weren't wearing headphones. They were really listening to each other and reacting dynamically. But, it's hard to convince artists that that's the way that it makes sense to record like that. It's actually really hard on a drummer to do that, because the drummers can't play at their usual volume. So it's a different concept. It's a different way of working. And somewhere in 2002, I met Jean-Claude Renaud in France, and we were discussing the issues and the loss of the passion we felt. Like there were certain, when you put the headphones on, you just kind of lose the balance between musicians. Actually, I could give a whole class on just how to use headphones to get the right dynamic for the particular session, even when you're doing an overdub. Because still, as a studio, I have to do overdubs. That's just part of the gig. But when we started Blue Coast Records, we wanted the passion. And the way we found that was without headphones, people playing live in the same room where they could hear each other, positioned where they could hear each other. Not two microphones, not the headset with the two microphones. We weren't doing that. That has its own set of issues that, believe me, my musician friends would come in and people would complain that, just because the drummer's playing the loudest, you would stick him in the back. It doesn't mean the musicians can hear each other. So we tested a bunch of ways to record where the mic placement was going to be. But the key was really getting the musicians to sit in a way where they could hear each other and react dynamically.
Yeah, more like a jam session, right? I mean, really, that's where the fun and creativity is, sort of figuring out the song for the first time. And sometimes, that first take is always going to be better than like the 20th take, when you just, at that point it just becomes a memorization thing, right? And you sort of lose the fun of the, what happened at the beginning, right?
You're absolutely right. Every musician kind of has their peak point. And for the singer or the person who knows the song, it's usually the first take. And then after that, it's sort of a balance. It's almost, I don't know what to call it. It's kind of like a gamble. Like you do 2 or 3 takes and you figure out, okay, at this point, this is when the average, you get the best out of all of them. But, sometimes you just want to go with the lead vocals because that's who's telling the story.
And most time the recording engineer's in a separate room, but you're right there in the mix of the artists as well, right?
No, we're in a separate room.
Oh, you're in a separate room. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there have been times where we've brought the musicians into the control room.
Okay.
Actually, a little while ago, the musician requested it, and we put up one mic and we all took instruments and played along with him as he sang and played solo. But for the most part, we actually have a separate room where the piano is, and we put the musicians in that room. I don't have visual contact, but that's okay because I just listen and use my ears. And we yell a lot at each other.
So as I understand it, you call this extended sound environment, correct? And why does this technique matter to the listeners at home? What are they hearing differently than a normal recording session?
Well, that's a great question, because one of the thoughts I had when we first recorded the Blue Coast Collection 1, it was also surround was brand new. And it was a way for me to see if I could really get the sensation that you were in the room with the musicians. And so we worked a lot on microphone placement. And we also had the surround set up in the control room. So we were hearing the way we wanted to hear. So you could hear the placement. You could, you just knew where people were positioned. Mm-hmm. And we wanted to make sure that that was coming across. And I didn't know how it would translate. I knew that for us, it was an experience that was just kind of an amazing experience. And so when we put out the first recording, I wondered, how does this translate to other people? How does it translate in languages that don't speak English? Right. And the response was pretty overwhelming. Actually, one of the reasons why we decided to continue and make more recordings like this was because there was a forum in France that had, wasn't even aware, but they had picked up like a 5-song early EP that we had released. Mm-hmm. And there were hundreds of comments on the recording, and it was all in French. So I had to use the Google Translator, and I went on, and most of them thought I was a man, which was kind of funny. And I'd come on and say, oh, by the way, here's a picture. And, so that was sort of amusing for a while. And I discovered that from what they were saying, it, the feeling and the passion apparently did translate. So I was pretty happy about that.
And that album, the Blue Coast Collection, is actually the first introduction for me to your recording studio. I can't remember when I got that CD, but that was, many, many years ago. And now I notice on the website, it looks like there's been 3 iterations. Like you talked about putting it into surround sound, and now I see there's a remastered version, which I didn't even know about. What did you do to remaster the latest version?
Well, it's an interesting thing. After we did the first one in surround, actually it was a test to see if this was something we wanted to pursue. And I decided I didn't want to use my home studio, so I chose the best studio, no holes barred. Money was not the object, and I spent a lot of money. Actually, there's a really nice article in Mix magazine from 2004 where we had invited the writer to come, and he did a really wonderful job talking about that session. And unfortunately, after that, it was just not feasible. I'll never recoup the cost of that first album. Yeah. So we had to devise ways to use my studio to do that. So we had to pare it down. We do this. Just the stereo recordings now. I could, eventually turn them into kind of a mock situation, but they won't have been recorded in the same way with the intention of surround. Now they're recorded with the intention of stereo.
Let's talk about a little bit of about vintage gear versus modern digital. I know you talked about how you're still using that Lexicon 224. I've actually really gotten into restoring old vintage hi-fi gear from like the 90s. It was interesting in that, I'm really into rebuilding DACs and old preamps and so forth. And one of the cool things that was happening in the hi-fi audio side of things back in the 90s was, in order to really improve the sound quality of the end result of the music, they were really working hard on creating the circuit that was coming after like the DAC chips. Like everybody was using the same DAC chips back then. And the real beauty of the sound from between one manufacturer to the other were the output stages. And, I found these days, a lot of the equipment, they're not putting all of the, I almost want to call it romance in some ways, because it's really an art form of what some of the people in the 90s did in terms of those output stages. And today it's all about banging out equipment as fast as possible to get as much on the marketplace to make as much money as possible. Obviously, there's great manufacturers out there, but, the bulk of the, we'll say mid-fi and lower is all about just getting stuff to maximize on revenue, if you will. And so, you're still using a piece from, 1987. Can you speak to a reason why, you're sticking with the good old stuff instead of going to today's technology in your recording methodology?
Yeah. I mean, you and I are a lot alike, except I don't rebuild gear. I know very little about going inside and all the things, but using my ears, I can I can say that you're right, especially now when we were doing the DSD. In the early days of DSD, and oh, by the way, yes, we recorded the DSD on those first sessions in 2002. And from there is where we made the surround mixes. And I'll get back because I remember now you were asking me about the difference in all the remastered versions, and it has to do with that. So anyway, we decided to make a commitment to DSD because we really did like the sound. And in the early days, I was still committed to tape. I still am. I just can't get great tape.
Yeah.
But as far as the gear goes, I even remember I got the 224 XL. There wasn't a whole lot available. I think Dave Van Hoy that I'd mentioned earlier, I used to hang out at Sound Genesis and whatever they had new. And he somehow talked me into buying this $10,000 piece of gear. And I remember at the time, my dad wanted to shoot me because he said, you could buy 2 brand new Volkswagens with that. And I thought, well, I don't want a Volkswagen. I don't care about a new car.
Sure.
I want this reverb unit. And I got really used to the sound. I still, creating new sounds on it all the time. But what was interesting is I did another session at another studio that had the reverb that predated the 224 XL. It was called the 224. It maybe cost a little bit less. It didn't have nearly the same functions, but the basic sound quality, I still remember, was just overwhelming. And then what happened was, I think, Lexicon, like a lot of other companies, as you mentioned, needed to sell more, take the price down.
Yeah.
They came out with the PCM 70. I had one, and truthfully, I still have one. I didn't like the sound as much as the 224 XL. And then when the updated 480 came out, which was the $10,000 model, to me it sounded like 2 PCM 70s. And then it was year after year of, oh, this is great. But really, they threw in a couple of extra functions, and it wasn't just them. This happened with all the companies, whether it was the Yamaha or whatever. And they'd make a big splash. Artists would come in and say, hey, I just heard about this $1,000 reverb unit called the SBX 90. Do you have one? We're only going to come in. I said, but I got this $10,000 reverb unit. You want? Okay. So, you keep buying gear then to satisfy the customers.
Sure.
And finally, you just run out of money and room. So I think it was around 2000. I said, that's it. But we started being provided by the manufacturers, because we did do a lot of testing, with units to test. And in the early days of DSD, I remember when we wanted to go to DSD 128, we started using the Korg units. And the problem was the outputs sounded terrible. The recording in was fine, but the outputs, it was almost unbearable to listen to. And then if you pulled the actual files into a different device or software program, they sounded fine. So as you were mentioning, I think they were just lowering the quality on the outputs to save some money. And the sad part is most people don't know. But I've heard about a lot of people sort of restoring these devices and, putting better output chips in and all kinds of things like that.
So let's talk about formats for a second, because, I've gotten really back into, I talked about this with you last time. I'm really back into physical media. I went through the stage where, in my younger days, I grew up in New York. I was a DJ. I spun a lot of records. Then, the revolution of CD came along. Then the big thing was ripping all your CDs to a server to play it back that way. And then streaming services come out, and streaming services were fun for many years for me. I enjoy it, and it's a great outlet to sort of find, okay, what do I want to buy physical media in, right? It gives me a chance to hear different artists and figure out whether I like them before I spend a ton of money on a physical media. And now I'm really getting back into, as part of the restoration process, you'll see my Revox B77 back there. I'm back into tape. I just restored a Sony tape deck that I had back in the 90s. Let's talk about formats a little bit. I saw something on Cookie's Corner where you were talking about, would you like Blue Coast Records to start doing tape again? Are you thinking about doing some tape? And what are your feelings on digital versus tape versus vinyl versus where are you in all of that? Where do you sit?
I love tape. I still love tape. The problem, I mean, my machine, I bought it brand new in 1986. It's an Otari MTR 90.
Yeah.
It works great. The problem is the tape itself. So, when you're spending $200, $400 a reel, I don't even know what it is now, but we had to do a tape project the other day. If you want to do more than 2 or 3 takes, it's a lot of expense for the tape. And the problem is the manufacturers, because they're not making it in the same bulk rate that they did before, it's really kind of questionable. So each batch is different. And it used to be you get a bad batch of tape, okay, pretty soon next week there's going to be a new batch. But now it's just, you don't know what you're getting. Some of the tape that sits on the shelves of some of these places, it just gets sticky and old. So we actually go through a process, and people are probably going to complain about this, but we bake the tape. We do a lot of tape restoration too. Mm-hmm. Just give you a quick shot of my walls, but it's still my thing is to let's go through all the tapes. And I've got a whole room full upstairs of 2-inch tapes, and let's restore them, put them on digital. Yeah, so that's really the issue for me is the quality of the tape and then the expense. So as far as doing, our recordings for Blue Coast Records, we've pretty much switched to trying to do everything to DSD 256.
So what do you gain or lose if, let's say, you take a master, you convert it to DSD, and let's say you want to make tapes from there? Are we losing something when going through that process versus a tape-to-tape recording? I don't know a lot about the bulk production of tapes that would go out to the consumer. How does that work?
One thing about tape is when you store it for a long time, well, even day to day, it doesn't have the accuracy of playback the same way that digital might. So the things you have to contend with is if you're restoring a tape, this happened to us a couple of weeks ago. Artist comes in with a tape he recorded 30 years ago, wants to do a guitar overdub. So you bake the tape, you put it on, everything's working, it sounds fine, but the guitarist uses a guitar tuner that's tuning to A440. And then he's playing and the whole thing is out of tune. It's a good chance that the tape machine is not going to play back the same speed, and especially over that period of time. But even day to day, like if you have ever tried syncing up 2 tape machines without the SMPTE, and even that has its flaws, a tape machine may not guarantee playing back the same way, even sometimes within the same day. And some of that is just the stickiness of the tape, what happens, at the where it's going through, and all the, the servos and things that could get a little sticky. The tape itself starting to shred, and I don't know if that answers your question, but
Definitely. So let's get back to digital. So, I read on Cookie's Corner as well. And for those of you who don't know what Cookie's Corner is, it's a page on their website where they've got a bunch of blogs, as well as I think you post this stuff online on Facebook. And what's the new platform you just introduced to me last week? What was it called?
Substack.
Substack. Yeah. So I read a bunch of your stuff on Substack. I already forgot what it was called. I got to get used to it. But I know you're creating 2 versions of all releases you're doing. One for optimized for streaming masters and one for audiophiles. Maybe talk a little bit about what you're doing there and why.
Yeah, well, DSD has a lot of dynamic range. Mm-hmm. And by dynamic range, it's actually the volumes and the peaks is what I'm referring to. So what's happened over the years, and it kind of started with the CDs, is CDs started getting louder and louder and louder. And what that does is it just kind of crunches up everything. We call it flat tops. The top pushes the bottom up and the top's down. You start losing frequency response at really high end and even the deep low end. So for our DSD recordings, we chose to keep the dynamic range. for a lot of people, that means they actually have to use the volume knob and turn it up. And that was okay for audiophiles. And we stayed away from the platforms until about 5 years ago. We didn't put anything on streaming because we had a pretty good community. And then when COVID hit, we thought we better take a different action. And the other thing was streaming was becoming more and more popular. And our artists who didn't really understand the audiophiles' needs kept saying, why are my songs softer when my song comes up? And I would say, well, just use a volume knob. Yeah. And then, the mainstream, you might as well forget about it. If they can't hear it in their car or their, whatever, they're just going to ignore it. They don't really understand the intricacies that we do as audiophiles, or even the frequency response, or the detail coming in a panned image. This year, we decided to create what we call optimized remasters. And that means we're optimizing it for the mainstream. Right. And it took me a while to come up with a word that I thought wouldn't be objectionable and sound like, might be okay. Because actually some of them sound really good. And I use a very different system. Most of the recordings, not all, most of the recordings when I mix go through a very old Studer A to D that's still tube-based. And so it sort of gives a tube response. And then when we put it into mastering, we can increase the level, and we do put the limiters on. So it is going to sound different and louder. And we, compare it to other recordings on Spotify, or we use what's called LUFs. And we try to, what the current accepted LUFs are. We try to hit with our optimized masters without going too overboard. But for the audiophile edition, it's going to be softer. We put those out. We have those streaming on Qobuz, and we sell them as downloads at bluecoastmusic.com. Mm-hmm. So that's what we've been doing in 2025. And the goal for me is to actually go back, optimize all the previous masters, and it's going to take a while. So, we're not in a big rush to do it, but it's just on our list of things to do. And at the same time, we sort of took, earlier, we had taken the reverse approach, which was at Blue Coast Music, which is our store, not the label, but the store, we actually take in other independent recordings. Almost impossible to find a recording that was done to tape or DSD. Mm-hmm. So we took in PCM recordings. In some cases, we were able to remix. In some cases, we were able to remaster. And we try to get more dynamic range. So the downloads we sell are called Audiophile Edition when we're selling other people's masters. So we remaster for Audiophile Edition, and for our own stuff, we optimize for the remaster.
And then I also noticed on your website, so I haven't been there in a little while. I noticed now you're selling MQA download files as well as MQA CDs. There's lots of different formats. There's FLAC, there's WAV, there's DSD, there's different resolutions. Maybe talk a little bit about when you initially do your recording, it starts out in this format. And then from that format, within DSD, at what resolution do you typically, record at? And then how do you create all of the other formats that you're producing and selling on your website?
For Blue Coast Records, currently we record to DSD 256. We use a Pyramix system. If I'm hired as a studio and I need a lot of tracks, which is generally the case, like if I'm going to record a drum set, pretty much we're going to go to Pro Tools. And our Pro Tools system is separate. So we have four different digital audio workstations. We might even have more. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, the Sonoma system only records to DSD 64. Mm-hmm. It sounds great. It sounds unbelievable. I think the DACs on that system are the best. But there was such high demand. In fact, it was David Robinson at Positive Feedback who said, Cookie, I'm going to send you my Pyramix system because you have to record at DSD 256. I said, really? And, at first I wasn't used to the DACs. They were just a very different sound.
Right.
But he was right. Our
Yeah.
customers wanted DSD 256 at any cost. So what we typically do is, for Blue Coast Records, record to DSD 256. If we're recording to Pro Tools, whether it's 4896 or 192, we'll mix everything to DSD 256.
Mm-hmm.
Simultaneously, we'll mix everything to 44.124-bit using that Studer system, which sounds fantastic. And truthfully, most of the artists want the more compressed version anyway.
Yeah.
That's what they're going to sell. So we use the DSD versions for Blue Coast Music. They take the other versions for their CD manufacturing or streaming.
And then how did MQA come into the mix? Because now there's tools on both sides. There's tools on the recording side. There's also tools on the consumer side to sort of change the sound. And so what do you got? We just had a great interview with Lenbrook and MQA. And so what's your take on MQA and what do you like, maybe don't dislike about it? And how are you using it for advantages for audiophiles and people that love music?
I think at the time we had an association with Tidal, and I knew the folks who were behind MQA, and they approached us for, hey, won't you please do some MQA? So we had some great conversations. We would send them the files, they would encode for us. And then they went through some transitions, and truthfully, I don't know where they are. So we personally didn't get a lot of demand. I mean, most of our demand is for DSD 256. So we've only got a small showing of MQA files available. But I wanted to have them there. I think in our test downloads, we have usually an MQA file so people can at least test their systems to see if it'll play.
Yeah.
But, personally, I like DSD. So that's where our hearts lie.
A fun topic that we dived into on our first call was the talk about we need to bring back trades in America, right? We're really losing the ability to do very specific, well, we'll call it hand-orientated things, but I mean, this equates also into the studio, and it equates into people that are making their own music. I mean, we're losing so many trade skills these days, and one of those is engineers, right? Anybody that's got a laptop now, right, can do all kinds of creativity of creating any kind of music. And now with AI, you don't have to have any skills, and you're just creating music that really doesn't come from, in my opinion, a passion. The AI is just generating something to maybe collect revenue on, right? I don't think there's any passion to letting AI create a song for you. But, we had this long conversation about the loss of skill sets in trades, and, creating music in an engineering environment is something that's getting lost, right? You were saying how you can't even, it's difficult to go to school and learn how to be a mastering engineer these days, right?
Oh, yeah. Not only mastering engineer, just recording in general. It's very expensive to bring in even a drummer or a band and get the experience. You can't get the experience from recording one band.
Yeah.
Let alone the amount of time required. And there's so many considerations when you're recording. It's not just about where you put the microphones and getting a great sound, but even more important is getting great music. And that's a skill that's really forgotten is how do you talk to the musicians in order to, prop them up, make them feel great, like, so they're not scared. Because when you've got, I used to call it a match to gasoline. You put money and creativity on the line, and there's an explosion waiting to happen.
Yeah.
So one of the big things we teach at the studio is how to deal with the artist when they walk in the room. It's theater.
Yeah.
I mean, we just, they don't teach this in the schools.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, it's interesting. You and I were talking about the plumbers, and it's a lot the same. And I remember a few months ago, I got a really great plumber, and I started asking him, why did you choose this profession? So he said he'd gone to the trade schools. It seemed interesting. And they taught him exactly what to say and how to behave. And I thought, that's a skill that's missing in most of the audio schools. The audio schools are pointed towards making money. They make money by sponsoring certain kinds of gear. Yeah. That gear is geared towards, nowadays, the songwriter, where they're going to sell the most, or people who don't know, or push a button for some software that's going to give you an automatic preset group of chords. Mm-hmm. They're not really geared towards teaching people how to be engineers in a studio relating to the customer. Yeah. It's about, what can I create at home?
And it's not just recording schools, but I think it's all universities. I mean, they've all become businesses. They don't really care about the education is honestly secondary and maybe even third in a lot of universities, right? It's all about how much money the university can make off of whatever, sports and, and funding for this, that, and the other thing. Yeah, it's crazy the way the world has changed.
It's funny because even back when I was a music major, I remember I dropped out after about 2 or 3 years because I already had 80 piano students, and I was looking at the people graduating, and they were working at the local crepe factory as a waiter or waitress. And I thought, is this, what am I getting out of this? Yeah. And at the time I was going to school, there was no audio schools. I didn't even know I wanted to be an audio engineer until I was kind of forced into the position. And the music background probably was the most important thing that helped. Yeah. Teaching was another aspect, learning how to make a phone call back and running a small business, which I had been doing since I was 14. Those were the skills that were needed, how to relate to the customer. Yeah. That's just a forgotten skill.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, I recommend to all kids, go get a job in a diner. Go do a waitressing job. I mean, I did that as soon as I got out of college, because it forces you to put yourself out there, right? You've got to talk to a stranger. You've got to make sure that they're happy. It's all about communication. And, we also talked, I think, a little bit about COVID. The whole world has become so antisocial. We're all glued in front of screens and, sitting in a corner with headphones and not gathering around with other friends to listen to music. And, I mean, I miss the days where, I got a new record and we all got together and we looked at the, the sleeve and read all about the band and all that stuff. We need to get back to community and gathering together instead of all this isolationism. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Were you in a band?
No, I was a DJ. So I was born and raised in New York in a great time during the 70s and 80s with disco and the, hip hop coming out and break dancing. And I got really involved in, I just, when I heard hip hop for the first time, and I listen to all types of music now, but something about it was so different, and the passion that it gave me for music, because I was really bored with music at the time, to be totally honest, but it was so different. And then I went to New York Beach, and there was a DJ out there with big speakers cranking out music, and everybody's dancing on the beach. And so, I got really into DJing because I was like, wow, this guy, it's a different type of musician, right? You're not creating music, but you're using other people's music to change it and create something new and wild. And the passion that the DJ had given to all these people that were dancing on the beach in the sun. And, I got enamored by it, and I got really, really into music at that point. And then, went to Penn State to become an acoustical engineer, but I changed into structural engineering because at the time, some of my classes were being taught by television. And back then it was very different than, the online learning that sort of came out of COVID. Back then it was like a 13-inch screen, and I'm like, I'm paying $14,000 and I've got to watch a teacher on a 13-inch screen that I can't see, that I can't talk about. So I changed directions to structural engineering, but I've been an electrical engineer ever since, so I sort of kicked myself in the butt all the time for changing. But my passion is in, the delivery of music and getting the goosebumps, from listening to music and stuff like that. I just love the music. And that's the same reason you're in this. Neither of us are getting rich off of this, right? We make a comfortable living, but we do it for the passion, right? It's all about the passion of the reproduction. On my end, it's the end result. On your end, it's the beginning, right? So,
well, and for me, it's the community. too.
The
I mean,
community, without a doubt.
when you were talking about playing vinyl for each other, when I was in the band
Yeah.
before the studio, I remember everybody brought in their favorite record and we played songs for each other. And we'd
Yeah.
all sit and listen before we'd go down and rehearse the music.
Yeah.
And nowadays, I don't even listen to music that much on my own because we hear so much music in the studio. But what I found after COVID, what I really missed was having the artists come in
Yeah. Yeah.
and sharing with them, getting them to get their creativity going. Because I mean, to be an engineer and fully focused, I had to give up being a musician. So I no longer play the piano. Oboe is long in the past. The sitar is up in some room somewhere. But where I enjoy is the exchange when people come over and they get their song recorded. We had this one couple come in for 3 years, making 3 albums every Friday. And it was just like, okay, it's coffee time. When you talk about what you were doing, and sometimes I'm thinking, we should probably start recording. But it was part of the just being there and kind of warming up to sharing this experience.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. So let's talk about the Blue Coast Records store. Where's a good place for people to sort of start? I mean, there's a lot of music on there, and I find these days, and like I said, part of the reason I do a lot of streaming is to find new artists. What's the best way for somebody to go to Blue Coast Records and figure out where to start with some of these artists? What are some good downloads that you'd recommend for them to get going? I know you've got some compilations. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. The compilations are really a great place to start. Blue Coast Collection 1 is still our best seller, after, 20 years. And the other compilations do really well. Truthfully, it was something I learned from my days at Windham Hill. I worked at Windham Hill as an A&R producer, and you could see the compilations, I don't know, like 10, 20 times outsold any individual artist recording. Now,
I have one of those CDs.
do you have Winter
Yep,
Solstice
yep.
too?
I don't remember which one I have. I have to go back and look. I was trying to figure out what the album name is. I have to go on my server and see. I've got it ripped.
Yeah.
But anyway, not to cut you off there.
So when I started Blue Coast, and decided, okay, now we're going to make a label, because truthfully, that first week in the studio, I wasn't really thinking we were going to make a record label. In fact, it was Gus Skinnis from Sony who said, "Cookie, you're making a record label out of this, aren't you? You're going to put it out." And I thought, yeah. We didn't have a name, we didn't have anything, but it was like 4 or 5 days into recording where somebody else told me, "Hey, you need to get this out in the world." So the collection's been going on, and then, we learned that the compilations still do point people towards artists that they might like, but it's really the compilations are our best sellers. So the next one is Blue Coast Collection 2, and has a few more slightly different artists. And then again, we have 3, 4, and now 5. So we have 5 compilations of Blue Coast Collections. We've got a couple of other, we've got a compilation of piano solos and piano duos called Mostly Piano. There's New Discovery, or the Discover albums, which are artists that just came in to play and we thought they were great. So they were just new artists that we maybe never did a full album with. So that's where I would start. And each of the pages actually has a link to a YouTube video, so you can get a kind of an idea of if you like the music or not. Yeah. But one of the interesting things is because it's recorded live, I call it chamber acoustic music. It's small, it's not big drums. And funny enough, I love recording drums. So there are a lot of albums that I recorded for other people that exist on Blue Coast Music because I like the music and I knew it was of a certain quality. We had the DSD mixes, whatever, but they're also bigger albums. In fact, if anybody's interested in hearing some of the music I recorded in the past, on Co-Buzz, I think it's a playlist called Cookie Marenco's History of Recording #2. And there's, a bunch of albums that I've found, but you can hear the big bands that I've recorded or some of the jazz ensembles, things with just bigger sounds that people kind of want.
And we're looking forward to do a Moon Audio playlist with you guys. I mean, one of my favorites that I got introduced from the first compilation was Keith Greeninger, Looking for a Home. I mean, that song is just magical. I use that to demo gear all the time. I take it to shows to demo gear. I've introduced other people at shows. They're like, who is that? Who is that? Where can I get that? I mean, I'm a huge fan. And you're introducing me to some new ones like Art Lande, John R. Burr, which I haven't listened to yet. I know it's tough to ask you this question, but what are some of your favorites?
Oh boy, there's so many of them, and the thing about the artists that we work with is we sort of found most of them because they hired me to produce their records.
Yeah.
And I may have heard them do something and thought, wow, on their own records, they want to make a bigger recording. They want to have the drums. They want to have all kinds of stuff and overdubs. Okay, that's fine for their recording. Hey, why don't you come in, record just you and the guitar or you and the piano?
Yeah.
But truthfully, I think all the artists on Blue Coast I had recorded before in a bigger ensemble. And most of them, or they were session players brought in. That's how I heard Keith and Dan Kai, was they came in to play on somebody else's session. I thought, oh man, I need to call this guy back. And that's kind of what happened, is when it came to the actual recording of the Blue Coast Collection 1 was I just called up my favorite artists who I knew could play for hours and feel comfortable with that while I, experimented with mic positions. And it's just not easy to find an artist who's comfortable in their own skin. So most of them are session players. Most of them make money on sessions, so they don't really promote themselves very well or much because that's just not their gig. They're used to going on tour, being in the background, and things like that. But I would say, like, I love Meghan Andrews. I love the music she records. I love the way she plays. Oh man, she's got a guitar. The song I'm on Fire, the opening of this with her guitar playing live is magic to me.
And it was fun talking to you about how, I'm a huge Pixies fan. You had Frank Black in the studio many, many years ago, and I'm a big Primus fan, and Brian, I think. And I mean, just fun, 2 degrees of separation things of Kevin Bacon here. Really cool how you've had some great experiences and meeting some crazy people over the years, I bet. Any funny stories, like one funny story you can sort of tell everybody out there? Somebody crazy you met or something, or a weird situation in the studio with somebody, or something fun, or...
Well, do you know who Max Roach is?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
So I had to be interviewed to record Max Roach, and it was probably his last album. And I've recently found out that the label never put it out, so I've been talking to them about putting it out somehow. But anyway, he came, I had to be interviewed. And the studio was on the side of a mountain. And I remember I knew his drum tech because he knew Sonny Simmons. And when I played with Sonny Simmons, and if you look him up, Sonny was a wild man. He used to play with John Coltrane and Billy Higgins and all kinds of great players. In fact, Sonny owed me some money, and he left John Coltrane's bamboo flute in the back of my car. And I said, Sonny, $40 or I keep the flute. I never got the $40. Sonny's passed away. Flute is somewhere under my house, and I mean, it's amazing. But anyway, when I said to the drum tech, I said, didn't you used to be with Sonny Simmons? He goes, no, that wasn't me. That was my father. And Max said, you know Sonny? And I said, I played with Sonny. And that was it. I was hired on the spot because I think Max felt comfortable, that I could speak his language. I knew the jazz language. I knew behind the scenes in their history.
Yeah.
So we recorded this just wonderful record where a woman, Chen Bing, came and played the gusheng, improvised on it. And yeah, I'm somewhere, I've got to find it. And well, I actually have the master tapes here.
Yeah.
So I want to talk to them about just let's remix it, put it out. But Max was just something special.
So I know you're going to be doing let's talk about some upcoming things. So, obviously I hit the Audiophile show scene, and that's where I first met you many years ago at Rocky Mountain Audio Fest. Hoping to see you at some of the other shows. I know you're going to be doing a Bay Area Audiophile Club keynote. What's that? Tell us a little bit about what you're going to be doing there, talking about.
Well, I've been invited to do a keynote speech to a new group called the Bay Area Audiophiles. I haven't told them this yet, but it looks like I'm going to be available and able to make the date. And so go and talk to their group. And I'm excited about that because we used to have a Bay Area Audiophile Society. Yeah. And then it merged and it grew and it ended up over in the East Bay. And I'm still in touch with that group. They've changed the name to something else. But, COVID kind of spread everybody out. And I think there was just a need for the peninsula, the Bay Area Peninsula, to have, a way to get together and have a little community.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and we used to invite them over here. We had a few sessions. We'd invite artists in and, we'd funny stories. But, I remember audiophiles are a breed unto themselves. And, yeah, I know you know. And so there's, you just don't put two microphones up and call it a day. That's not how things get recorded. You don't just listen with your ears and hear a musician and suddenly think that you can replicate that or want to replicate that on a set of speakers. Yeah. So here's another story. So one time we had about 20 audiophiles, and actually the record is called Mutineer. And it's with Jenna Mammina and Matt Rawlings. Matt plays piano. He's was a Nashville session player. Great. And Jenna is an amazing singer. She's got a very soft, delicate voice, but she's amazing. So Matt has to play very soft because there's no headphones. And in the background, you won't even know it, but there's about 20 audiophiles sitting there listening to her. So what we would do is we would have them play the song. They'd come into the control room, which is a pretty big control room, and I'd play back and they go, that's not anything like, we could barely hear her upstairs. Right. Well, you got a giant piano and you've got a voice that needs to be in a, if you get the breath off, you start singing too loud, intonation goes. So that's not the goal. The goal is piano player has to play a little softer to be able to hear, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But anyway, when they hear this translated on speakers, they don't understand that too much piano, no vocals is just not going to work to sell it. So we have to mix a different way. That's always an amusing thing is when an audiophile says, well, why does I want it to sound like what it sounds like right there? Well, guess what? You think you do. But in reality, when you take it home, you probably don't. Yeah. So there's a lot of work that has to be done, and also position of microphones because you need to get a little more isolation on a guitar. You've got to get a little closer. Guess what? You're going to get a lot more bass response. So maybe you have to EQ that out. Where for whatever reasons, psychologically, our ears sort of adjust for the room that we're in when we're not listening through speakers. Yep.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your stories today. For everyone watching, you'll find links below to Blue Coast Music Store where you can explore Cookie's catalog. Everything from Keith Greeninger to Tony Furtado and Fiona Joy Hawkins. If you want to test what your system can actually handle, check out those free downloads in 9 different formats. And follow Cookie's Corner on Substack, where she shares thoughts with 38,000 audio enthusiasts. At Moon Audio, we know that great sound starts with great recordings, and that's exactly what Blue Coast delivers. If you'd enjoyed this, subscribe and hit that notification bell. We've got some more conversations coming with innovators who are advancing how we experience music. Cookie, thanks so much. This has been a pleasure, and see you next time on the Fidelity Exchange.
Thank you for having me.